Our next speaker this afternoon will be Christopher Quinn, who studied communications at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His practicum was completed at Sandia National Laboratories, California, and his talk title will be Identifying Causal Influences in Networks of Stochastic Processes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk about identifying network structure based on time series. I'll talk about two different domains where a common problem appears to give some context to what we're trying to do. Our brains are massive communication networks. There are on the order of tens of billions of cells, trillions of connections. And scientists know that the wiring, which cells connect with which cells, which regions of the brain connect with which regions of the brain, plays a very important role for how information is stored and processed, whether it be language, motor control, sensation, etc. But it's very challenging to identify the wiring, the circuitry. The traditional way for tracing out the diagram is by taking an animal, whether it be an octopus, a sea slug, etc., killing it, taking a slice of its brain tissue, and then looking under a microscope and just tracing it out. But that requires a lot of time, a lot of graduate students. In recent years, recent decades, there have been advances in recording the activity of the brain. So while you're sleeping or doing a crossword puzzle or reading, you can watch as different areas of the brain light up. You can also record groups of cells becoming active under different tasks. And there's great interest in being able to take time series of brain activity and use it to infer the connectivity. This problem appears in other areas as well. One of them is in social networks. So humans have been forming social networks for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. And social scientists, anthropologists, psychologists are interested in understanding the dynamics of how people interact, whether it be at the home or in school, at the workplace. And questions such as who influences whom? Does the daughter influence the dad, or does the dad influence the daughter? And again, a traditional way of identifying these interactions is to do observational studies. So psychologists might go to a kindergarten and just take notes as to which kids are playing with which other kids or bullying, who's bullying whom. With the advent of online social technology, it's created a change in the paradigm because interactions are stored online as people use MySpace, Twitter, Facebook, etc. All of the interactions are stored as data. Every picture that you view, every message you post, link you click on, all of that is stored. And so again, there's interest in being able to take these time series of activity and use it to infer essentially who's interacting with whom, who's influencing whom. Now in some social networks, there are user-defined relationships, such as in Facebook, you have friends, Twitter you can follow, Pinterest also followers. And that gives some information. But for instance, Barack Obama and Justin Bieber have about 50 million followers each. And you could debate as to, do they have equal influence in the Twitter world? Are all the followers equally influenced? Or is that label, a follower label, not capturing something more unique to each user? And so, again, the common thread is that we have a network, and we can observe the activity in the network. We have time series of activity, and we want to be able to understand who's influencing whom or who's interacting with whom. And so this is the major problem that I've been working to address. And so the goal is to develop a framework where we can take time series of activity, we can take data, and then produce pictures, summaries of who's interacting with whom. And now graphs are a very natural representation of networks. The nodes can represent the processes, whether they be cells or genes or people or computers or whatever it is. And the edges, in a sense which we'll have to consider, will in some sense measure or represent influence. Now there are three main tasks to develop this framework. One of them is just deciding what the edges mean. So we want the graphs to be meaningful. So for instance, in the top right-hand corner in the graph with x, w, x, y, and z, if there are edges from x to y and z to y, does that make sense only separately, or can I consider x and z together as influencing y? If there's no path from y to x, but there's a path through W. Does that mean anything? If If there's no path, does that mean anything? So we need to define these graphical models. We need to develop algorithms to find them efficiently. So some of the networks that we're considering are very large. Again, could be tens of thousands of genes, could be tens of billions of cells in the brain, or billions of users in a social network. So we definitely needed efficient algorithms. And since we want to be able to take data, we need good estimation techniques to compute the statistics in order to run the algorithms and find the graph. So I'll very briefly touch upon those three different thrusts. So first, again, we need to know what the edges mean. And so one way of statistically assessing causal influence it uses something called Granger Causality. Clive Granger was a Nobel laureate in economics. And back in the 60s, he proposed a definition for when you can say that one time series causally influences another time series in a statistical sense. And it's rooted in the idea of prediction, that x causes y if in trying to predict y at time t, and I have access to the past of the whole network, if removing the past of x significantly impairs my ability to predict y, then x influences y. There's something in the past of x that's related to the future of y that's not captured anywhere else. And he instantiated this using a linear model. So you do two linear model fits, y at time t depending on the past of the whole network, and then you remove the past of x. You compare the error variances, and if there's any statistically significant difference, then you conclude that x influences y, otherwise not. And this has been widely adopted over the years in the social sciences, economics, psychology, biology, and physics. But it's very simple, very easy to use. But it's limited in that it can only capture linear relationships for continuous valued data. And there are many networks of interest where the relationships are nonlinear or the values are discrete. And so we need something more powerful. So part of my work has been to show that there's a measure called directed information, which I'll represent as the I in this formula on the bottom, which generalizes the linear models. And so for any stochastic distribution, this measure is defined and essentially captures Granger's statement of predictive power. And we can use it, again, we can compute this value, and if it's bigger than 0 or some threshold, then we say that at some process x influences another process y. And so that we know what the graph is, what those edges represent. We can now think about ways of finding the graph. So first I'll mention some exact algorithms. So one follows straight from the definition. Where we test every single possible directed edge. So very parallelizable, very easy and simple. A second approach is to more of a dynamical systems approach, where we think of each process as depending on the past of the whole network. And then one by one, we test each process in the current parent set and ask, does x actually influence y given the remainder of A? And so one by one, we can shrink down the parent set. And so both of these will work for any type of network, no matter what the underlying topology is or the dynamics. But unfortunately, they require very high dimensional statistics. So I need to ask questions, does x influence y given the whole network? Now, if I'm just talking about a very small network of like school children, like 5 children, that might not be a problem. But if I'm looking at the whole Facebook network of 1 billion users, that's a very high dimensional statistical quantity and very hard to compute or estimate. Now, in many real-world networks, there's some sparsity or some knowledge of the dynamics, which we can use to leverage to develop simpler algorithms. And so part of my work, which I won't go into details, is that for certain classes of dynamics, you can use smarter algorithms. Also, if you have some sense of sparsity of the bounds on the indegrees for the nodes. So for instance, if I know that, say in Facebook, there's only at most 5 or 10 people that have a strong influence on me, I can ask much lower dimensional statistical questions in order to find those 10 people. I don't need to consider the whole network at once. And so those can get the exact topology, but perhaps more interesting is to find good approximations. Because in many cases, networks of interest might be too large to visually comprehend. So the whole point of having pictures to make it easier for scientists, researchers, or human decision makers to be able to just look at the results and kind of comprehend what the network looks like. So Facebook has over 1 billion active users. That's a massive network, a huge number of edges, especially if most people have 200 or 300 quote-unquote friends. But again, maybe only a few they really interact with. And so even for a network on the bottom left-hand corner of 11 users, within degrees at most 4, it's hard to visually process all the different pathways. It's very complex. So for some applications, we might prefer to have a much simpler representation, such as in the bottom right, a directed tree, which is a connected graph, and each node only has one parent. So you can think of it as the most influential parent. And there's a root node with a directed path from the root node to everyone else. So it's much easier to comprehend, to read this picture. And so for some applications, we might be interested in trying to find good approximations. And so quite a bit of my work has been to develop algorithms that can find provably good approximations, and that can both to make it easy, visually comprehensible result, and also for scalability of the algorithms. So for directed trees, for instance, we can find the best directed tree. There's a doubly exponential number, so we can't do an exhaustive search. But it turns out that the quality of an approximation decomposes nicely in terms of how much influence each parent has to the child. So for instance, in the bottom right-hand corner, if I pick a particular directed tree, and I consider each edge weight as the influence just from the parent to the child, not conditioning on the rest of the network, then the sum of those edge weights tells me how good the approximation is, and that leads to a very simple algorithm to identify the best graph by using a maximum weight directed spanning tree algorithm. And we've also considered higher order approximations. So directed trees might be too simple for some applications, such as not being able to represent feedback. So for instance, in our bodies, in many of the biological networks in our bodies, feedback is crucially important for maintaining homeostasis. And for visual processing and audio processing and social networks, feedback is crucial. So we also developed algorithms to find higher in-degree approximations, where the researcher can control how visually complex the result is and be able to trade off the computational complexity and accuracy of the approximations with the visual simplicity. And we've also looked at more other approximations, but in the interest of time, I'll have to skip through. We've also considered estimation techniques and developed provably good statistical estimation techniques for parametric distributions for this quantity-directed information. So essentially, if you can have a model for how a process y at time t depends on the past of other processes, again, whether it be my usage of Facebook depends on how my friends use Facebook. If this predicts a logistic model, but any parametric model where you can get good estimates of the parameters, this technique can compute the directed information reliably. So I'll just quickly mention 2 applications. One is in neuroscience. We have collaborators who study motor control. And so this part of the brain does motor planning. Another part of the brain does motor execution in terms of telling the muscles to move as compared to planning out which muscles to move in what order. And they had observed that between those 2 areas, there were waves of propagating activity that one group of cells would become active, then another group of cells would become active, and so on, propagating waves for regional observations. And they also took individual recordings of cells, and we analyzed it, and we got the graph on the right, where we found a large number of edges along the same direction for the propagating waves of the primate that they had recorded from. So just that we were able to elicit the highly fine resolution, or the local structure that gave rise to the regional dynamics of information transfer. And also, we examined different levels of approximation complexity. So these are 3 different approximations within degrees 1, 2, and 3, going left to right. As you can see, as you go left to right, there are more edges, so it's more visually complex. It's a better approximation, but it's harder to look at individual pathways and see what node interacts with what other nodes and how, and all the different pathways in the network. In terms of the structural motif of these, the upward right diagonal, you can see that with in degree 1, it's a little bit hard to see, but then if you're willing to go a little more complex to in degree 2 or 3, you start to see more of that upward right diagonal structure. So there is a trade-off in terms of deciding how complex of an approximation to use. The second application was into social networks. So asking the question, can we infer who's influential in a network. And so the specific question we asked was, in Twitter, if we observed when people posted messages, could we infer who's following whom by just looking at the times that people were posting messages? And so we looked at 16 news sources and about 50 users, and we looked at the times that they were posting messages about the Syrian conflict during late 2013. And so just to give you an idea of the types of data that we're looking at the bottom right are 4 time series, and the top block lines are the times that there were messages about Syria, the Middle East, and the short green lines were about posts about politics or music or anything else. And so just by looking at data of this form, we were able to reliably estimate who was influencing whom based on the algorithms in a very simple model. In particular, the algorithms were able to recover about half the parents, so they had moderate true positive rates, but they had very few false positives. So most of the labels that were identified were very reliable. And with that, I'd like to finish, and first of all, thank Krell and CSGF for making the past 4 years very wonderful and possible. Also my advisors, Nagar Kevash and Todd Coleman, as well as my collaborators, including my practicum advisor, Ali Pinar. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll take any questions if you have any.